Hello everyone. We are continuing to share our content and our materials with you in this challenging time, and this time I would like to share my keynote address to the summer school of the University of Göttingen, which was called Shaping Future Landscapes with Perspectives for Trees, Cows and Snails. In this keynote address, I touched many topics related to our everyday life, as well as some economic concepts and indexes, green growth versus degrowth, GDP versus SDI and other indicators, and also kind of reviewed practically what is the future of our landscapes in terms of agriculture, in terms of bio-based materials, in terms of energy production, in terms of construction, fashion, industries and other industries. I hope the content would be useful for you. Enjoy. Alright, let me start with the so-called pencil story. And I'll begin from a quote by a famous American 20th century economist Milton Friedman, who said, "Look at this pencil. There is not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. The wood from which it is made comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down the tree, it took a saw. To make a saw, it took steel. To make a steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's actually graphite, compressed graphite, and I'm not sure where it comes from. But I think it comes from some mines in South Africa. This red top up here, this eraser, a bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber isn't even native. It was imported from some South African businessmen with the help of the British government. And this brass ferrule, I have not the slightest idea where it comes from. Or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who do not speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might even hate each other if they meet." And in the end of his speech, Friedman adds, "That's why the operation of free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world." And it seemed Friedman might have actually had a point back in 1980, highlighting how great was capitalism and globalization. There were only 4.4 billion people on Earth, but still plenty of resources and an amazing nature around. So, nothing at all to worry about. Only these guys from the Club of Rome, with their 1972 book Limits to Growth, kind of gave a hint that eternal growth is not possible and it had to stop somewhere. But no one bothered listening to them as life was getting better, more beautiful, satisfying and comfortable every other year. What we see, however, that most of their predictions are coming to reality. This is quite incredible. On the graph on the right you can see these lines that were first projections and then real observations. So there we are, suddenly being moved from a small world on a large planet to a large world on a small planet. Just think about this wonderful expression. I once heard it from Anders Weikman, the honorary president of the Club of Rome. So, how do we actually see the emergency? This model and the evidence of planetary boundaries by Rockström and his colleagues shows that we are actually breaking certain boundaries like genetic diversity, which is loss of biodiversity, nitrogen and phosphorus use. It means we can't sustain the current pace of certain activities. And part of the problem lies in defining our goals. By the way, this famous expression in the title is from a comedian. I hope you have seen that video, but if not, I will send it to you. Because it's really about people and our survival, not the planet actually. So that's, the problem is in defining our goals, and that's how we arrive to GDP, and I would like to GDP. Because Pencil story showed the micro level of the 20th century capitalistic reality. But there is also a macro level, the level where governments compete with each other in success using the GDP, gross domestic product, which is the total output of all goods and services produced in the country. GDP has been chosen as a measure of success, of course, and on the other hand, wildlife, biodiversity and nature were just being taken for granted. As Senator Robert Kennedy famously said, GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Of course, the number of GDP does not measure health, education, equality of opportunity, the state of the environment, and many other indicators of the quality of life. And as Jeremy Land puts it, anything that causes economic activity of any kind, whether good or bad, adds up to the GDP. An oil spill, for example, increases GDP because of the cost of cleaning it up. The bigger the spill, the better it is for GDP. I have been in a meeting quite some years ago with the former education minister of Bhutan, who said about another example. Feeding the child with mother's breast milk is good for the child, but buying the child food pack is good for GDP. It's funny, but true. Okay, but are there alternatives? Well, the closest one, it seems, would be the SDI, and that's Sustainable Development Index, introduced by Jason Hickel, a British anthropologist and economist. And while taking the base from Human Development Index, it has added some sustainability-related parameters, such as the CO2 emissions per capita and material footprint per capita. You can see the top 20 countries by SDI on the screen now. And I was wondering why SDI hasn't become popular in our time, but maybe this top 20 is part of the answer. Why it hasn't gained popularity. Okay, but if we're using another indicator, can we at least decouple our economic growth from the growth in energy consumption and emissions? Because there has been a lot of conversations around this, and I'm afraid the answer on the picture. Up till now, up till recent time, it wasn't possible. We can see the clear correlation between CO2 emissions and GDP. While this relation is strong, even stronger is the relation of energy consumption to the GDP. Like you can see on this graph produced by one scientist in 2013. And you can see that R squared equals almost 0.99, which in statistics, as I bet some of you know, is an insanely strong correlation level. And it has been similar to this for the last nearly 150 years. So up till now, just to repeat, gross domestic product is almost 100% correlating with the amount of energy we are consuming to make that GDP. You might say, well, it's good that we are finally moving towards green energy, at least, and renewables, but the following graph shows how small is that fraction of renewable energy in the total energy demand. And yeah, the reason for it to be so small is not that we are not developing renewables that fast. The real reason is that all the other fuels, fossil fuels, and finite resources use is growing enormously as well. And it keeps growing even these years, despite all the pledges about transitioning to net zero in a beautiful moment in time. So you can see on the right how oil is growing, how coal is growing, how gas is growing. This is really bigger and more skyrocketing growth, even if we compare to the renewables. Yeah. What makes things sometimes even worse is the lack of motivation. The fiscal regulation that I call fiscal discouragement, because we really do not value, as a society, as a world, we do not value finite resources, but instead our governments tend to overtax labor. That's a very nice example. I remember listening to Frans Timmermans at the event in early 2019 at the conference in Brussels, saying that, look, if I want to repair my toaster, it will cost me 25 euros. But if I want the new one, I could have it for just 12 euros. And of course he was making this point like an illustration that common sense is not working and it should not be the case in a normal world. But we have what we have. That's because of overtaxing labor and very little, let's say, very small price for our finite resources that are used to make the new toaster. Now, that brings me to the fight between two concepts that are on our future development, basically. On the one side, we have people who say that we should transition to a green growth, to the green growth. But on the other side, we have others who, like Jason Hickel, like Club of Rome and other economists who say that we cannot have growth all the time, and if we want to reach our climate goals and pledges, we have to plan and run a controlled degrowth. And yeah, of course, green growth means that they say we should ensure the rise of GDP, but that increase would not harm the environment. But up till now we have seen that this is not working. By the way, I really recommend this book of Jason, which is on the left, Less is More. I will put it into the literature list in the end, but it's a very interesting view on things, and I guess it will be useful for you. And why, you would ask, why is the donut in the middle? The answer will come a bit later on the other slide. So while our discussions and talks are going, we have reached this point. On this slide you can see how overwhelmingly humans and farming animals, and these animals are serving humans as food, dominate the entire ecosystem of mammals in the world. So look, we have humans here in the middle. All the light gray, which is around, is either our pets or the livestock that is food for humans. And this is our realm. And you can see that pigs, goats, sheep, cattle. Only those green blocks are wild mammals that are left on the planet. But it's not just mammals. No doubt, biodiversity loss pace we are having is dramatic. You can see the drop measured in BII, the Biodiversity Intact Index, which summarizes the change in ecological communities in response to human pressures. The BII is an estimated percentage of the original number of species that remain and their abundance in any given area, despite human impacts. So basically, it is the relative coefficient of how much wildlife and all the wild species are left on the planet. But what's interesting, there is this very recent study by Sitra in Finland that claims this situation, this biodiversity loss, can be fixed solely with a circular economy. Solely with a circular economy. We can see that on the right. They claim food and agriculture gonna play an amazing 73% part in this recovery, and some other sectors like building and construction, forestry, and 5% textiles. So the circular economy models, behaviors, techniques could restore biodiversity loss on its own. And of course, I will leave you the link to this study in the literature, so you can read all of it, and yeah, it is worthwhile anyway. Because this study emphasizes how circular economy can hold and partly reverse biodiversity loss by 2050 through policy, business-led interventions in all these mentioned sectors. And these interventions are focused on regenerative production principles, as well as on business models that extend product lifetimes, increase use rates and cut waste to reduce our extraction of resources, and in turn they tackle the key drivers of biodiversity loss, such as land use change, climate change, pollution, direct exploitation, and an invasive alien species being spread. So really recommend reading that. But let's move on. I'm sure you heard of what circular economy is, and of this circular economy butterfly concept by Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And maybe you've also heard about the donut economics that embraces planetary boundaries as well as human needs for decent living. Well, if not, I will leave the links to these materials in the final slide with literature. But while it's worth saying that while the first one is an answer to how we treat resources and materials, the donut answers a broader question, like what should our future economic model be? And perhaps this donut economics approach could be a solution to a growth or degrowth dilemma that we have seen on the slide a bit earlier. Because it's really about what is essential for humans, this green area, what is optimal for human beings, that will live happily and in well-being, in comfort. And those planetary boundaries by Rockstrom, they are just there on the outside. yeah, I will leave the link to this explanation in literature for those of you who would like to read more. You could do that, and yeah, I advise to do that. Anyway, regardless of which model we will choose, the landscapes will gradually change. So here we come to the main topic of today's session and your summer camp in general, the landscapes. And they are, of course, I can imagine you know that and you observe that, they are largely defined by their users and the function they are performing. It's always about choices. And in this sense, we are on the verge of a few land use dilemmas that I would like to discuss here today. By the way, on the picture you see a field of grain in Kherson region, and on the background you see a huge wind turbine. It's Kherson region in Ukraine. So the first dilemma is, of course, food versus biofuels. And of course, you probably know that modern biofuels are often advertised as a boon, as a solution for the climate. But let's take a bit closer look on this. Because as an investigative group, Transport and Environment shows, the land used to grow the biofuels consumed in Europe covers 14 million hectares, the area larger than Greece. Of the soy oil consumed in the European Union, for example, 32% is eaten by cars and trucks. 32% of soy oil. Yeah, also 50% of the palm oil used in the EU and 58% of rapeseed oil also goes to that, to the cars and trucks. Altogether, 18% of the world's vegetable oil is turned into biodiesel, and 10% of the world's grains are transformed into ethanol to mix with petrol. Can you imagine? And the concerns is rising. The concerns are rising. On the graph on the right, you can see prices on key foods in Germany. It's where it's quite recent. You can see 2022. Why is that? Because, Ukraine accounts for 40% of the world's sunflower oil exports, and it is a major rapeseed oil supplier to Europe. So as seaports blockade took place, I should say while seaports blockade took place, Western European countries continued to burn 19 million bottles of sunflower and rapeseed oil every day in cars in the end of July. 19 million bottles of sunflower and rapeseed oil every day in cars. Just imagine. That is, by the way, as for end of July. And as biofuels by itself raise demand for land, rainforests, marshes, and savannas in Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, and Africa. These lands are cleared to ensure we have fields for biofuels. But another big problem with biofuels is their low energy return on energy invested. You can see some figures here on the slide. Some are on the chart and they are older, and these ones are newer. The latest studies show that ROI for bioethanol were just 1.8 for sugarcane, close to 1 for corn, and 0.739 for wood. So you actually, if you think about it, if you process wood leftovers to biofuel, you are getting less energy than you use to actually produce this process. Insane. Well, second dilemma in land use is food versus electricity. I bet many of you have seen some nice fields with solar panels or windmills that look gorgeous and empower our perception of energy transition, which is satisfying. But some, like the author of this article in The Guardian, says it is absurd to fill fields with solar panels. And this claim is understandable, since in that case you steal land from the agricultural supply chain. But how can we set priorities? We need to transition in our energy demand. We need to ensure sustainable food supply. How to make these choices? And that's an open question. But even here, there are some wonderful solutions that are grabbing ground. For example, look at these vineyards. You can see solar panels put up above the vineyards, protecting the grapes during periods of extreme cold. And they also protect grapes from the extreme heat. Yeah, and they also they can turn so that you permit more light to hit the crops on cloudy days when you are worried that wine is not getting enough sunlight. And another early, he also found that the panels significantly reduce air temperatures, which would benefit farm workers tending to the plants. So it looks like we can combine electricity generation and farming, but of course for now these projects are rather exceptional. Land use dilemma number 3, and that's I call it food versus birds, and by birds I mean all the wildlife and nature. But once I went to a Dutch farmer when I was writing my master thesis on dairy farms and all the benchmarking. So he had some subsidies from European Union because of the wildlife around, and he was funny saying, and over there I have some birds and I don't touch them, and the European Union is paying me for this. So I remember that quite well. It was very funny. It is related to food production versus wildlife and nature conservation, because more and more we can see that large agricultural productions are sometimes harmful to the wild ecosystem. The bees, birds, all the insects and weeds that live in the fields or nearby agricultural operation sites. The European Union, however, has adopted regulations on this matter, which are part of the European Green Deal. And according to some of them, land use under organic farming, for instance, will reach 25% of all farmland in the EU by 2030, although now it's only about 9%. And some say that as a result of such regulations, food production in the EU will fall by 20% in volume. And of course the challenge is, or even 25% in volume. And the challenge is, of course, how do we fill the gap? That's again an open question, and the answer could be we will import it, and it could be again Ukraine. We don't mind that, and we certainly can do that, but we will have to see. It's a challenge. What about new bio-based economy? This is, I put it as a question. There is no new dilemma, but we have already considered 3 dilemmas, and it seems like there are already too many. But we still have this emerging bio-based economy subsectors coming up, like growing plastics to substitute the oil pumped plastics, growing houses to substitute concrete and steel, and growing clothing. And where do we find land for this? Again, open question, again compromises, and I guess every government, or hopefully together within the European Union or some other super national authority, will have to decide upon this. Now, all that was related to rural landscapes, which are, which is like more common to call landscape when it's rural landscape, because when it's urban landscape, it's not that much landscape, right? We just call it like urban area, but it's still very important. And here is a good example on how the street might change, and again might change back actually. More than 40 years after parts of this canal in Utrecht were concreted to accommodate 12-lane motorway, the city was celebrating the restoration of this 900-year-old channel. So can you imagine? I think some of you might have been in the Netherlands lately, and in Utrecht perhaps in particular, which is an old, charming town, well, city of course, but it seems like it's small, it's cozy, it's beautiful, and I bet you cannot imagine this 12-lane motorway almost in the center of the city. I cannot imagine, definitely. So these urban changes are also very important for our CO2 emissions, for our wildlife, for our mobility, and they also are landscapes of the future. And move towards the wrap-up, I would like to talk a bit about what we could do to make a positive change. And what we have to do is we have to support and facilitate circular innovations. Here I'd like to mention the importance of circular design, because whatever you guys will be creating or producing in the future, there will be a design stage. And at the design stage, we take important decisions, which according to European Commission define 80% of ecological footprint at any product. So once you've made an omelette, it is quite hard to separate it back to its components. I think you get what I mean. And to support this methodologically, I will include into the literature list the Circular Design Guide developed by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where you can really check all the steps that help you to design in a circular way. But let's look at circular examples, some cases that save resources or use them in a smart way. For example, this beer brand decided they will brew their drink with abundant, not consumed dry bread, which is quite simple but genius idea. So in this way we combat food waste and we produce a new product. Next one, the beer bottle. This bottle by one of the Dutch beer brands used the product life extension circular model to cycle the same bottle around without breaking it and recycle it as glass. Such a reuse scheme was an experiment so far, but it's an inspiring one, since 74% CO2 reduction has been recorded, which also means less energy used and less pollution. You get it. So far, though, too much about beer, I know, but bear with me. Next one is jeans. Very simple, but another great story comes from Ukrainian designer Ksenia Schneider, who is famous for reworked and upcycled denim. And this case lies within a resource recovery circular model. They have been upcycling 5 tons of old discarded jeans every year, and they're selling new clothing. They have been famous all over the world and participate in major fashion weeks like Paris, Milano, etc. Very nice. Circular supplies. What about an eatable packaging from seaweed and plants? Easy. There is this startup or company, OHO, which is a perfect solution to pack sauces or some bites, and then it either biodegrades in the environment for 4 to 6 weeks, or you could simply eat it. No pollution, bio-based, very good. Doesn't lay down on landfills. And again, we are coming back to biodiversity loss. Why? Because we have to ask, you might ask, why such solutions are important, and why is it important that they penetrate the market more and more. But remember this graph I showed you before, and said biodiversity loss can be restored with circular economy, especially within the food and agribusiness sector. That's why. That's why all these bio-based and nature-based solutions matter a lot. And yes, we can, if we do our best. Your generation has to lead, I guess. Now, literature. I promised I will leave you some literature which will be useful in your future learning and even within this summer camp. And this is, of course, Donut Economics concept by Kate Raworth. Very important. Butterfly diagram for circular understanding. Less is more, which is the book, so it will take probably quite some time to read it, but I do advise it. Our webinar with Jason Hickel. We had also with Jason Hickel, but this one is with Anders Wigman. It is a YouTube video, but very useful, how to advance the circular economy after Corona crisis. Then this link to a study how circular economy can tackle biodiversity loss by Citra. Of course, Circular Design Guide by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and a little bit of entertainment. I really think that this series, Clarkson's Farm on Amazon Prime, is useful to watch. I bet some of you may know Jeremy Clarkson from Top Gear. So now he's a farmer. And if you will perhaps having some parties over there in Göttingen, then you can use this DJ set we have produced with Korolova DJ at the solar power plant at outskirts of Kiev last year. But as a bonus, I'd like to show you some stunning photos by Edward Bortynsky. the multiple award-winning Canadian photographer, originally from Ukrainian family but born in Canada. When Burtynsky was 11 years old, his father purchased a darkroom and cameras so he could play with it. And utilizing his new hobby in the end of 60s, Edward began photographing events and providing portraits at his local Ukrainian community center, charging 50 cents per photograph. While the money he made were quite small, but he still used them to travel through the countryside of St. Catharines, photographing the pristine landscapes of his childhood. And this is where he would later attribute his interest in pursuing landscape photography. Much later, in 2003, Burtynsky revealed the Manufactured Landscapes collection. It is a collection of more than 60 large-scale images, like this one, depicting his travels around the world, capturing stunning transformations of nature into industrial landscapes. So there they are, some of these amazing photos. They put it into one of the articles. Burtynsky's photos have the texture of neo-expressionist paintings, darkly dangerous portraits of devastation. When we look at these landscapes, we see devastation, we see oil spills in the Niger Delta, but it is also stunning. It is really beautiful to see. So it produces this about mixed feelings, if you want. Yeah, I don't know how the landscapes of the future will look like, certainly, but I'm sure you're the generation to decide upon this. So I wish you patience, luck, and success in your journey. And would like to end my speech with quoting Sir David Attenborough, the great British scientist and director and explorer, who said, "Anyone who thinks you can have infinite growth in a finite world is either a madman or an economist." No offense, guys from economics faculties, because I'm also at large the economist myself. But still, we have to realize this. Thank you for your attention. I'll happily listen to you, to your remarks, and maybe questions. Please.